Welcome to the podcast prepared for RSM 322. This is a podcast for including topics B and C. This podcast deals primarily with advanced variance analysis in both production and revenue centers. The problems we'll be doing come from your textbook. They are 4 in number. One of them is actually a case, and I will be going over each of the problems in succession. So if you want to stop the podcast now and try to do problems 12.12, 12.20, 12.13, and case 12.1, I would suggest you do that first before listening to the answers on this podcast. So here we go with problem 12.12. And problem 12.12 deals with Howard Binding Company, which makes 2 types of notebooks, large and small, and they use cloth material to make it. Now, Howard manufactures, has a purchasing agent who buys the cloth, and this problem was chosen because it shows the 2 different points in time, at which the price variance can be calculated. First, at when the goods are purchased, so at time of purchase, and secondly, which is more commonly when the goods go into production. This was when the price variance was calculated and was taught in RSM 222 and 322, but the alternate calculation at the time of purchase may sometimes be superior. So let's take a look at Howard Binding. Now, at the time of purchase, there were 35,000 feet of material purchased. It was purchased for 1 penny more per foot than anticipated in the standard price. So there was a $350 unfavorable price variance at the time of purchase. However, when we look at production, there was only 31,500 feet used in production. The actual quantity then times the 1 cent unfavorable price variance ends up with a $315 unfavorable price variance, not a $350 one. And of course, the second part of the question asks, why do the 2 differ? And the answer, as you probably guessed, is relatively simple. There was more equipment or more direct materials purchased than there were used. So these 2 amounts differ because the purchases are larger than the amount used. If, in fact, the opposite was true and we used less than materials that were purchased, so we drew on inventory, in other words, so the purchases were less than the actual consumption, the price variance at the purchase price would be less than the price variance at use. So the situation would reverse. Now the question still remains, why have another time to calculate purchase price variance? Why calculate it at the time of purchase? Well, if we have a purchasing manager, the measure of the purchasing manager is not complete if price variances are only calculated as the quantity is used. For completeness' sake, the purchasing manager should be evaluated based on the purchases that he or she made in their entirety, not on partial purchases as those purchases are used in production. So, secondly, it results in a timely measure of the purchasing manager. So if, for example, the price variances were computed at the time of use, the reported price variances would not be reported until the material is used unless the material was used. So if the material was purchased and held in inventory for 6 months before it was used, the purchasing manager's current performance would not be reported for 6 months. Now this delays any corrective action senior management could undertake in order to circumvent a potential out-of-control situation in the purchasing department. So where you have a purchasing agent, the most desirable way is probably to use a purchase price variance rather than a production price variance. Now the next problem, 1220, deals with Starling Coatings, who have 2 inputs to create an undercoating, a waterproof undercoating called Zerton. There's 2 inputs, Magna 45 and Zelon. And the question is, what should be the mix of the 2, ideally to produce the lowest cost on a single batch of Zertan? Now the question itself contains a schedule of how much the combination of Magna and Zelon needed to make 1 batch of Zerton. You should note that there has to be some of each raw material in the batch. So if you take a look at the schedule of the various combinations needed and price those combinations, you'll see when you review the prices that a combination of 6 gallons of Magna 45 and 5 gallons of Zelon actually lower the total cost to $49, which is per batch of Zerton, which is the lowest cost available. Any other mixes result in higher costs. However, this isn't the end of the problem, because Part B says as the fiscal year begins, so after these standards are established, 6 gallons for Magna and 5 gallons for Zelon, the price changes on the inputs. The price of Magna falls to $3 per gallon. The price of Zelon rises to $7. And the first question is a production standard of 6 gallons of Magna and 5 gallons of Zelon still produce the lowest cost for the batch of Zerton? Now, factoring in the new prices, you'll find out that no, in fact, that combination of Magna and Zelon does not produce the lowest input cost for Zertan. With the change in price, the mix should change to get the lowest price of $50.25 to 8 gallons of Magna and 3.75 gallons of Zelon. However, Starling has a policy of never changing its standards during the year. And the next 2 questions, Part C and D, deal with what happens. What would the Zerton production manager choose to do after the price drop? And currently, because the quantity standards are not altered to reflect a change in the mix, the manager producing Zerton would try as much as possible to adhere to the quantity standards that were established at the beginning of the year and not alter it, because they're penalized if they alter it by producing an unfavorable quantity variance. So the manager won't tend to alter the mix of Magna and Zelon as the price changes. Now that seems counterintuitive to what you want the managers to do. So the question arises naturally, why doesn't Starling change its policy? Why does it insist that the standards stay constant after they are struck at the beginning of the fiscal year, regardless of the change in input prices? And the answer to that illustrates an issue. Starling bears a cost by not adjusting its standards more frequently than once a year. And of course, the nature of the cost is that Starling managers continue to make decisions based on old or stale prices. However, changing the standards more frequently reduces the benefits of using the standard costs as control devices. Now, if you're frequently changing the standard costs during the year, then all you're doing is making it easier for managers to argue that any variations are not their fault. They're all beyond their control. A policy of frequent standard changes decreases the influence that standard costs have, and Starling, like most companies, is willing to trade off decision-making errors in order to maintain the integrity of the standard costs as a control device. So it is a trade-off. Now, in the case 12.1, which is a cigar-making joint venture between the Cuban government and Domingo Cigars of Spain, Domingo Cigars has actually offered the Cuban cigar rollers $3 an hour. They're normally paid $2.50 to work in government cigar factories, but they're paid on a piecework basis. So that is translated into a per cigar rate. So the more cigars they make, the higher they get paid. Now, Domingo makes 3 types of cigars: Panatellas, Coronas, and Churchills, and all 3 use the same type of tobacco, but in differing or varying amounts. So the question then is, after the actual information comes in about performance, you've got the standards in a table that is included in the first part of the case. You're told that Domingo purchased 3.5 million grams of tobacco for $805,000. You're asked in the first 4 parts of this case to calculate the variances for both labor and for tobacco. So the first one we start with is the standard labor minutes for each cigar at $3 labor rate. At the $3 labor rate, the standard is actually 15 cents for Panatella, 20 cents for Corona, and 30 cents for Churchill. The tobacco price standard is actually the actual price is 23 cents per gram. The standard price was 20. So you know they used 3.5 million grams they purchased. So it looks like they've got an unfavorable price variance for the tobacco of $105,000. So they paid more for the tobacco than they anticipated. The quantity variance for the tobacco is unfavorable for all 3 types of cigars, most notably for Churchill's, which is using up 16.67% of the variance, the quantity variance. The lowest spoilage being, or the least unfavorable quantity variance being found in the cheapest cigars, Panatellas. Now, with respect to labor, we're looking at a labor efficiency variance that is favorable for all 3 types of cigars, most notably for the Coronas. And there's alternate ways of calculating the labor efficiency variance. You can either do the standard minutes per cigar, or you can do the minutes per hour, standard minutes, standard number of cigars per hour. Both will lead you to the same result. The Panatellas had 2,550 favorable efficiency variance. The Corona's 4,000 favorable, and the Churchill's 1,200 favorable. When we get to E, you're asked to take a look at these variances in more detail and comment on them. Well, the first one, obviously, you can comment on is the piece rate. The effective wage, when we translate how much they're making, because they're paid by number of cigars, When we translate that into an effective wage rate, we see that they're actually making, for all three types of cigars, more than $3 an hour. So, the piece rate system is allowing them to earn substantially more money than $3 an hour. Now, the favorable labor efficiency variances reflect the fact that the employees earned more than the $3 rate. They captured the benefits of their higher efficiency. Domingo Cigars, however, did not. The favorable labor efficiency variances reflect the gains that accrued only to the employees. Now, the unfavorable tobacco quantity variances reflect the rollers' inefficient use of tobacco or outright theft. Remember that the rollers are not charged directly for the tobacco used. Hence, it appears on the face of it that they've substituted more tobacco for less labor. Since Domingo paid above the standard cost for tobacco, it's likely that they received high-quality tobacco. It's very unlikely that they received below standard quality tobacco. Now, one student who actually visited an actual Cuban cigar factory reported that the employee theft of tobacco is very common. So the large unfavorable tobacco price variance is very troubling. There's also a difference between the Churchill and the other two cigars, suggesting that the Churchills were more difficult to produce, and the rollers wasted more tobacco and probably more time making the Churchills. So, what are we going to do about that? Well, there are some suggested possibilities. One of the first possibilities is that we can charge the rollers for the tobacco, the excess tobacco. So either increase the piece rate and charge them for the tobacco use, or just penalize them for the excess tobacco. Now, it may be too costly to meter the tobacco that each roller uses. Therefore, what you can do is just average the amount of excess per room, and then allocate this wastage to the rollers based on how many good cigars they produce. The obvious problem here using this technique is that you have free agency issues. So the best rollers are going to end up stuck with the most penalties for excess tobacco use. Now, anyway, the management should also, in addition to looking very carefully at what to do about tobacco, the management should reevaluate the labor standards on the Churchills. Relative to the other two cigars, the Churchills standards look very low, and it's likely at this point the rollers are trying to avoid making Churchills because they're going to ruin their opportunity to get a bonus. So they're going to try and make other cigars where possible. And lastly, I guess they should investigate security measures to reduce the employee theft of tobacco. Now, the last problem in this podcast deals with revenue variances and advanced variance analysis where there are sales issues involved. In this case, this 1213 is a problem about a woman named Sue Young who sells fax machines for fast fax. There's two types of models she sells. The 700 model is the cheapest, and the 800 model is the most expensive. And the contribution margins have changed during the month because the fax machines were imported and the foreign exchange rates have changed. So in the case of model 800, it looks like the foreign exchange rate must have gone up, and so they've raised the price. But in model 700, the foreign exchange rate must have fallen, which tells me that the parts for these things are manufactured in 2 different countries. So that's a signal to us, because if you take a look at Sue's performance, she has a 500 favorable overall contribution margin variance, but when you look, you decompose this into mix and contribution margin variance, excuse me, you'll see that the Model 700, there were more machines sold because the price dropped, and so we have a favorable quantity variance for the 700, but the 800 has a very unfavorable quantity variance because as the price went up, less machines were sold. So the price elasticity on these machines is probably fairly high, and the contribution margin variance, because we dropped the price, the contribution margin is unfavorable on Model 700, and because we raised the price on Model 800, it's favorable. But on 800, note the favorable contribution margin variance is not enough to exceed the unfavorable quantity variance. So this performance report should generally send a signal to Sue that you might want to suggest a change in venue for manufacturing parts of these machines, if at all possible. And the dropping of the price for Model 700 was brilliant, because it did increase the sales extraordinarily high, and she cleared 2,500 favorable off that alone. So that's the end of the Advanced Variance podcast. I hope it's been useful to you, and the next podcast deals also with Topic C, but this deals with total quality management in Topic C, so it was put in a separate podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it, and good night.